Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
The message landed in the family thread just after lunch, a cheery blizzard of digital snowflakes and exclamation points from Mom about ham and stockings and just us this year. Followed by Ethan's line that I read twice, because my brain would not accept it the first time. Let's keep it small this year. Just family. No losers. I stared at the screen long enough for the little typing bubbles to appear and vanish from a few cousins who knew better than to step in. Then I put the phone face down on the counter and listened to the humming refrigerator like it was an audience member who had finally heard the punchline I'd been building for years, because if there is one thing I understand at this age, it is that contempt needs a stage and an audience, and I had been paying for both. I could have called Mom and reminded her that just family was a phrase that used to include me when Ethan needed rent bridged until his bonus arrived, when Rachel needed the daycare deposit because the payment portal glitched, when the twins needed school shoes and those fundraiser boxes no one ever sells without a miracle, when the minivan left a fan belt and some pride on the freeway, and I quietly covered the tow and the repair because Dad's back was not up for the drive, yet none of that would have mattered now because Ethan had finally said out loud the subtext that has paid for his confidence since we were kids, and the only honest reply was silence, which I offered like a perfectly folded napkin placed to the left of a plate he never washed. I made tea, and while the kettle sang I opened the banking app and looked at the quiet little auto transfers that had become the background music of my life. The daycare cushion that hit on the first of every month because Rachel always swore their payroll timing was weird. The grocery card I kept in my name because bulk diapers and frozen waffles are not cheap and the twins had that hollow-legged phase. The vendor invoice payments that were routed through my account so Rachel's candle business would not get dinged for late fees when her supplier communication ran late, and for the first time I saw what they were not love, they were not respect, and they were not invisible. Because people who call you a loser from a safe group chat depend on you believing that money is the same as affection, and I am slow to anger but not stupid. I did not rage, I did not cry, and I did not write a long speech about boundaries that would be screenshot and dissected later over wine, because calm is the sharpest blade in a kitchen drawer full of dull knives. So I canceled the daycare auto transfer with one tap and set a note to myself that the portal works just fine when someone else actually logs in, and then I removed myself as an authorized user on Ethan's emergency credit line, which I had added when he started that sales job with the travel promises that evaporated like steam, and after that I called the bank and asked them to mail me written confirmation that my liability ended today, which they did in a tone that suggested they had heard my type of quiet before. The satisfaction was not fireworks, it was the slow warmth of circulation returning to a limb you forgot you were clenching, and I took that feeling with me to the hall closet where the hidden Christmas stash waited under a blanket like a guilty dog. The art kits and the remote control car and the soft pajamas in sizes I had guessed from memory, and I sat on the floor and read the return policies like a lawyer preparing closing arguments, because there is a difference between being generous and being used, and mine would no longer be confused for theirs. The pajamas went back to the store, the car too, and the kits I scheduled for pickup by the shelter downtown that runs a holiday market where single moms can shop with dignity for $0. And I wrote a little card for the box even though no one would ever read it that said, "For kids who will not hear the word loser this week," and the neatness of that sentiment pleased me more than it should have. While I was in the mood to tidy, I pulled the folder from the desk drawer that contains the old tax letters and receipts where my name shows up as temporary guarantor on the apartment lease from the year Ethan's commission structure changed and his manager forgot to advocate, and I emailed my accountant to ask, in the driest language I could muster, whether there was any outstanding documentation that still linked me to their obligations, and she called within 10 minutes and said, with that respectful hush good professionals use when you finally do the thing they have recommended for years, that she would draft the necessary releases and warnings, and I told her to send them certified mail, signature required. Because paperwork is a kind of truth you cannot talk over at a dinner table. There are moments when the universe offers you a petty exit and dares you to take it, and mine came when Ethan texted privately, a single line that read, "You okay? You're being quiet," an effort at control disguised as concern, and I looked at that sentence and felt a laugh rise, not mean, not cruel, just honest, because silence in me is not a symptom anymore, it is a decision. So I replied with something gracious and boring about year-end deadlines and a migraine and hope Christmas is beautiful, and then, because I have a sense of humor that has survived this family intact, I forwarded the donation receipt from the shelter to the family thread with a simple, in lieu of gifts this year, I'm supporting the holiday market for families who could use a lift. Merry Christmas, and I watched the read receipts pop up one by one like little porch lights flicking on, and I knew the message had landed where it needed to. My phone rang almost immediately, Mom's ringtone a chirpy melody I chose in a hopeful era, but I let it go to voicemail, and with the quiet that followed I opened my calendar and deleted the recurring reminder labeled first of month transfer. RN daycare, then replaced it with first of month, call the shelter, and as I hit save a new notification slid across the top of the screen from an unfamiliar number with a subject line that made my stomach tilt and my jaw set in the same motion. Action needed to maintain supplier account, Miller Candle Company, which would be strange for any bystander and perfectly clear to me, because there are strings you only notice when you stop holding them, and this one was about to snap in the loudest possible way. The following morning arrived with that peculiar stillness that always follows an emotional storm, when everything looks exactly the same, but the air feels denser, as if it remembers what happened even when you try to pretend it didn't. The sun spilled across the kitchen counter, lighting up the same mug, the same calendar, the same neat pile of unopened Christmas cards, and yet there was a different rhythm in my chest, a quiet steadiness that came not from peace, but from resolve. It's strange how clarity can disguise itself as calm. I wasn't suddenly enlightened or forgiving. I was simply done pretending that my patience was a virtue rather than a leash. I made breakfast, poured the coffee, and stared at the phone that had been buzzing since dawn with family chatter about travel plans and matching pajamas, as though the previous day's humiliation had been erased by new exclamation marks. Ethan had texted once, "You okay? You're being quiet," and then again half an hour later, "Don't take it personally, it was a joke." He used that word like a disinfectant, as if humor could sanitize cruelty, and for the first time in my life, I didn't bother replying, not because I was hurt, but because his need for acknowledgement had become the only currency I refused to spend. I worked from home that day, half focused on spreadsheets while half listening to the ticking of my decisions forming shape in the background of my thoughts. Around noon, I logged into the bank again and scrolled through the scheduled transfers, each one a small vein that kept their household breathing comfortably. I had never called it charity. I thought of it as balance, me helping where I could, since I had no family of my own and they always seemed to be dangling on the edge of crisis. It was never about generosity, it was guilt management. But that afternoon, guilt finally looked like debt, and I was tired of paying interest on it. So, one by one, I cut the lines. The monthly daycare payment, canceled. The automatic refill of their grocery card, paused. The small business account that I had quietly topped up whenever Rachel's supplier problem resurfaced, closed. Each confirmation email arrived like a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years. It wasn't dramatic, and there was no satisfaction in it, just the heavy exhale of releasing a burden you'd mistaken for love. I knew it would take weeks before they noticed. Dependency has a lag time, and by the time the absence registered, it would be irreversible. When the phone rang again, it was Mom. She spoke in that cautious, sing-song tone she uses when she's pretending not to know there's a problem. She asked if I could bring my famous pumpkin pie this year, though she knew perfectly well there was no this year for me. I told her gently that I'd be working through the holidays. There was a pause, that particular silence of disappointment that parents wield like guilt-ridden art, and she sighed, "You're always so busy, Sarah." I smiled because that was true now, and for once, it was by choice. That evening, I walked to the market instead of ordering groceries online. I wanted to feel the air, the noise, the small interruptions of strangers that had nothing to do with family politics. I picked up what I needed and paid in cash, something I hadn't done in years, and it felt oddly symbolic, as if the physical exchange of money meant something real again. I stopped by a cafe afterward, sat near the window, and watched people laugh beneath the twinkling lights strung between lampposts. Couples argued gently about gifts. A little boy pressed his nose against the glass of the bakery next door. Ordinary life, unpolished, unfiltered, and profoundly peaceful. When I returned home, a voicemail waited from Rachel. Her voice trembled at the edges of artificial cheer, that practiced tone of someone who wants a favor but knows she doesn't deserve it. She said she hoped I wasn't upset about the Christmas mix-up and that she could really use a hand with a shipment delay that was threatening her candle business. She added, almost as an afterthought, that she'd pay me back as soon as the next batch sold out. I listened twice, not because I needed clarification, but because it felt like listening to a stranger using the wrong script for a part one no longer played. I deleted the message, made myself another cup of tea, and finally opened the stack of unopened mail that had been sitting on my table for months. Most of it was junk, but one envelope caught my eye. A holiday card from my old college roommate, Beth. She'd written a short note about her kids and her new job, ending with, "You always had the best advice, Sarah. I hope you're still surrounded by people who appreciate that." I laughed softly because, of course, I wasn't, but for the first time, that didn't sting. Appreciation is a word that only means something when it's earned, and I had been giving discounts for too long. That night, I sat on the balcony with a blanket and a glass of wine, the cold biting at my fingers, the city murmuring below. I thought about all the years I had spent cleaning up after Ethan's disasters, patching holes he insisted didn't exist, listening to his endless monologues about how hard work always pays off, while he borrowed, forgot, and borrowed again. I thought about Rachel's bright smiles and the way she always called me sweetheart right before asking for something, and about Mom's gentle scolding that I shouldn't hold grudges, which really meant, keep sacrificing so we don't have to feel awkward. For once, the quiet around me didn't feel like exile. It felt earned. There was no grand declaration, no revenge speech rehearsed in the mirror, just the slow awareness that peace is not the absence of noise, it's the absence of obligation. I let the thought settle as the wind rustled the pine branches and carried faint laughter from somewhere down the block, a sound both foreign and comforting. Tomorrow, I knew, the phone would ring again. Rachel would try once more, or Ethan would crack a joke, or Mom would ask for just one small favor. And I would answer politely, calmly, maybe even kindly, but the support, the invisible lifeline they'd mistaken for weakness, was gone. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of fatigue and resentment, a spark of something unfamiliar began to glow. Not joy, not vengeance, just the first pulse of freedom, steady and quiet like the heartbeat of someone finally learning to breathe on her own. The email with the subject line about the supplier did not surprise me so much as confirm a suspicion I had been carefully pretending not to hold. Because when you build a household on favors and soft deadlines and the assumption that someone else will make the last anxious phone call, what you actually construct is a small and fragile market in which confidence is the only tender that matters. And confidence evaporates the moment a guarantor steps away. I opened the message and read the brisk, impeccably polite notice that Miller Candle Company's account would require immediate verification of payment responsibility due to recent changes to authorized contacts. An elegant way of stating that the invisible scaffolding had just been removed, and while I did not smile, I did acknowledge the mechanical elegance of cause and effect humming along exactly as designed. I forwarded the email to Rachel with an equally polite note that I was no longer in a position to assist with vendor correspondence and that she should contact the account manager listed in the signature, which I already knew she would not do gracefully because grace requires preparation and the habit of accountability. And those muscles atrophy quickly when someone else has always lifted the weight. Her call came less than 10 minutes later, the voice already frayed, the inhale before the first word too sharp to be anything but panic. And she launched into a stream of explanations that tumbled over one another in the familiar choreography of crisis management by charm. The holidays had created unusual delays. The last batch had a surprise defect in the wicks. The twins got sick, and she lost 2 days of production, and the supplier had been so understanding until now, which meant the supplier had been paid on time until yesterday. I let her speak without interrupting, not to be cruel, but because interruptions would have forced me into the role I was retiring, the fixer who translates excuses into logistics, and when she finally took a breath I said, in a tone I used to reserve for clients, that she needed to call the account manager, offer a realistic timeline for payment, and adjust her pre-order promises immediately before customers started requesting refunds en masse, and I added, gently but unmistakably, that any reference to my name or financial involvement would be inaccurate going forward. She went very quiet, and then, with the smallest crack of indignation, asked why I had made a unilateral decision right before Christmas, as though my withdrawal were a prank rather than the conclusion of an arithmetic she had always refused to learn. I reminded her that unilateral decisions were how invitations get rescinded in public threads, and that while I wished her business well, I would not rebuild a bridge I had been pushed from, and she made a sound somewhere between a scoff and a sob. And the line went dead, and I set the phone down and felt that odd mixture of relief and nausea that accompanies the first firm boundary after a lifetime of soft ones. An hour later, Ethan called with the voice he uses when he is selling, warm and performative, and just enough wounded to provoke guilt, and he announced that his hours had been cut because management is doing a restructure. A phrase that means as little in real life as it does in corporate memos, and he said they might need a short-term loan to get through the month while Rachel handled a minor supplier issue, and he assured me he would pay me back as soon as his bonus landed. Which created an interesting paradox I chose not to unpack because either the structure cut his hours or the bonus was still magic and imminent, and I told him calmly that I was not lending money to family anymore because it had never once remained money. It always turned into leverage and resentment, and I was tired of owning both. He laughed the brittle laugh of a man who has just been told the house rules now apply to him, made a joke about me becoming a Grinch in middle age, and when I did not rise to the bait, he tried a different angle, asking whether I had at least kept the monthly daycare cushion active because the twins program would not hold their spots without it. I said, evenly, that I had ended all automatic support last week and sent written confirmation to the relevant offices, and that they should have received notices by now, and the silence that followed felt like a hallway with all the doors suddenly closed at once. He murmured that he would figure it out and hung up without goodbye, and I sat very still and listened to the heater clank on, the city bus groan past, the ordinary life sounds that have nothing to do with the moment a family narrative loses its narrator. By late afternoon, the fallout began in the exact order I could have mapped on a napkin, a terse text from Rachel accusing me of sabotaging her by removing my name from the vendor account, a group chat message from Mom wondering if I might smooth things over until after the holidays, and a voicemail from Dad filled with that weary disappointment that men use when they want you to feel like the difficult one, so they do not have to confront the actual source of difficulty. I brewed tea, opened my laptop, and sent one email to the supplier's account manager, not to intercede, but to close the loop, stating that I had resigned all responsibility and that any further requests should go directly to the owner of Miller Candle Company, whose contact information I provided with clinical precision. Then, because revenge dressed as virtue is still revenge and I am not interested in lying to myself, I executed the smallest, neatest move I had saved for the right moment. I forwarded Rachel a PDF I had quietly prepared over the summer, a one-page plan for how to convert her most reliable wholesale clients into a prepaid subscription model with realistic lead times and a scaled-back holiday line that would actually ship. And I included a brief note that said, if you follow this exactly, you might keep the business. If you don't, it will fold by February, which was both help and a trap. Because doing the work would feel like obedience to me and refusing would look like pride to everyone else. Within an hour she called again, this time hoarse and furious, accusing me of condescension and control, accusing me of setting her up to fail, accusing me of pretending to help when all I wanted was to watch her struggle. And I let the accusations pass through me like smoke, then told her, with a steadiness I had earned the hard way, that she had one choice if she wanted the company to survive, and that I would not be available to repeat myself. And I ended the call before she could reply, not triumphant, not gleeful, just finished. I poured another cup of tea, turned off the kitchen light, and was halfway down the hall toward a long bath when the doorbell rang. Two hard presses close together, the kind of ring that belongs to someone who believes he is owed an audience. And through the peephole I saw Ethan on the stoop with a face I did not recognize, a streak of winter across his jaw and a certainty in his eyes that something, me, the season, the world, owed him a correction. And as I reached for the deadbolt, I realized that ending the support had only been the first act, because some spirals announce themselves politely and some pound the bell until the whole building hears. I opened the door only as far as the chain would allow, not because I thought he would force his way in, but because form matters when feelings are attempting a hostile takeover. And I wanted the metal line between us to do the quiet speaking my voice might fail to do if I let it carry the whole load. While Ethan stood in the glow from the hallway fixture with winter stamped across his face and launched into the kind of greeting that is not really a greeting at all, a surge of practiced indignation about family and timing and what you did to Rachel, each word delivered as if it were a bill I had left unpaid on a counter that, in his telling, had always belonged to him. He accused me of humiliating them with the vendor notice, as if the supplier's request for verification were my invention rather than the first honest breeze in a room I had been airing out alone for years. And when I did not flinch, he pivoted into that soft-voiced pitch he uses when selling a car that needs more than new tires, suggesting that I could hold the line through the holidays, and he would square everything once his hours bounced back, which is a charming way to rename a hole as a trampoline. I told him, slowly and without heat, that I would not be reinstalling supports I had removed, that I was done laundering emergencies into schedules, and that he should consider the possibility that my absence was not an attack, but the end of a subsidy he had mistaken for love. He laughed, not because anything was funny, but because laughter is the last tool left when your usual ones have been confiscated, and he leaned toward the chain and reminded me that I owe family and that I don't even have kids, as if the absence of children in my life were a blank check I had signed to his household by default. I let the chain sing a little as I tightened it and told him he was misquoting the covenant. What I owe family is truth. And the truth is that I have been underwriting his image of himself for so long that he no longer knows the difference between confidence and credit, and that it was time he learned. He started to raise his voice, the way a man will when he senses the argument is slipping through the fingers of volume, and the first real flash of fear pricked at me, not because I thought he would hurt me, but because I recognized the look of a person about to perform for an audience they cannot see, which in our case is always mom, always dad, always the old story in which I am the difficult one who refuses to be reasonable. So I cut the performance short by sliding a thick envelope through the gap at the jamb, the edges neatly squared, my name nowhere on the outside. Inside, I told him, he would find a ledger of every transfer, invoice, and emergency payment I had covered for him and Rachel over the last 7 years, line by tidy line with dates and amounts spelled out in full words, along with screenshots of the thank you texts he had sent in the first year before gratitude turned into entitlement, and a notarized statement from my accountant terminating my role in any of their accounts, plus a brief letter addressed to our parents that begins, "This is not a request for repayment. This is the record of why I am saying no, because history gets smoother when no one writes it down," and I felt obligated to add friction. He stared at the envelope like it might bite, then said no one needed to see our private arrangements, and that was the moment I realized what he feared was not hunger or rent or the loss of daycare spots. It was the collapse of a narrative in which he was the beleaguered provider propping up a chronically fragile sister, so I told him the most merciful truth I had. I had scheduled a message in the family thread for the morning of Christmas Eve with a PDF of that ledger and a single sentence. "I will not be attending or subsidizing this year. Please direct requests to their rightful owners," and that if he apologized in writing before midnight and corrected the loser line in the same public forum where he performed it, I would cancel the send and we could all preserve a dignified silence. He called it blackmail, and perhaps in some less honest language it is, though I prefer to think of it as a mirror held at eye level for a man who refuses to look down, and when he said he would not beg, I said I was not asking him to beg, I was asking him to tell the truth. We stood there, hallway chill curling into the warm threshold between us, and for a long breath I thought he might take the deal, because his eyes went soft in the way they used to when we were children, and he had taken my allowance with a joke and then given half back. Not out of remorse, but because he wanted to be liked, yet pride is a ladder with missing rungs, and he chose to climb it anyway, stepping back with a shrug that tried and failed to look casual, muttering that I was heartless. And that Rachel would never forget this, and I said gently that memory is not the same as a grudge, and that I was finally learning the difference. He left the envelope on the mat as if refusal could neutralize facts, turned toward the stairwell with a jerk that made his coat flap like a flag, and banged the metal door hard enough to shake dust from the exit sign, which felt theatrically appropriate and also, somehow, very small. I took the envelope back inside, because a clean presentation matters when you are preparing to be called a liar, and I laid it on the table beside my laptop where an email draft waited with the scheduled family message attached and the timestamp set for the morning. A small countdown I could almost hear, steady as a second heart, and I told myself I would sleep on it, not because I needed more time to decide, but because sleep is a kind of oath you make to your future self when the present you is tempted by messy catharsis. I ran a bath, let the hot water crawl up my spine and dissolve the tremor in my hands, and by the time I was wrapped in a robe and making tea, the phone began to strobe with notifications that arrived in a sequence so precise it almost formed a melody. A daycare notice reminding the account holder that unpaid balances trigger automatic waitlist reinstatement after the holiday break. A terse supplier follow-up to Rachel documenting that payment had not arrived by the revised deadline she had apparently promised without funds, a message from Mom asking if I could be the bigger person and float them one last time for the children, and finally, a text from an unknown number with a signature that snapped my attention cleanly awake. This is Marla from Human Resources at Kingsley Automotive. We are conducting a review of expense support statements tied to Ethan Miller's hiring file, and your verification is listed. Please call to confirm the status. Which was the moment I understood that my quiet had never been a vacuum, it had been a brace, and that removing it was not simply absence, but gravity, already pulling everything loose toward the center where truth waits without blinking. While the timer on my scheduled message kept it steady, indifferent march toward morning. The morning of Christmas Eve arrived with a sky the color of unpolished pewter and a hush that made the city sound like it was holding its breath, and I lay there listening to the small domestic noises that prove a life exists, radiator ticking, neighbor's dog pacing, distant delivery truck reversing somewhere down the block, while the scheduled message in my family thread clicked toward its appointed minute like a metronome I had set months ago without letting myself admit it, because it turns out that revenge, when done carefully, looks less like a firework and more like a calendar invite you accept with a polite yes, and then prep for in spreadsheets and notarized statements. I made coffee with the deliberate grace of someone defusing a device, opened my laptop, and saw the countdown in the top corner of the email client, 5 minutes until the letter, and the sentence that would break our holiday mythology into neat, dated pieces, when my phone rang with the bureaucratic chime that now made my shoulders rise an inch. Marla from Human Resources spoke gently and precisely, thanked me for calling back, and asked whether my earlier financial verification for Ethan's hiring file remained in force. A harmless phrase that wore steel underneath, because I knew what sat in that file. The letter I wrote 2 winters ago at his pleading, stating that I would stabilize emergency expenses while he hit his first-year sales targets. A kindness he had framed his new boss as proof of a robust support system, which I now understood was a euphemism for me. I took a breath that hurt coming in and told her, clearly and without apology, that the verification had been rescinded in writing with copies on file, that the employer should not rely on it for any purpose, and that any expense reimbursements or expectation of third-party backing tied to my name would be inaccurate. She listened, thanked me, and asked one follow-up in the implacable tone of a woman who has already assembled the puzzle and is merely confirming edge pieces. Had I been aware of any personal use of corporate cards justified under family stability language, and I told the truth I had been avoiding that I had not monitored his spending and would not speculate, and when we ended the call I turned back to the laptop and watched the last seconds evaporate, a small digital snowfall that ended with the soft thud of scent. The thread lit up almost immediately, the way dry needles on a tree flash when a spark finally finds them, and I read the staggered responses with a detachment that surprised me. Mom's first attempt at scolding that landed as tremulous confusion. Dad's grim request that we take this offline, Rachel's furious spiral about humiliation and sabotage, and then, after a pause long enough to suggest he had considered several drafts, Ethan's message that began with a joke that died in its own throat and ended with a refusal to apologize because family should not keep receipts, a line so honest in its entitlement that I almost felt sorry for him, because he had forgotten a rule I learned the hard way: people who do not keep receipts do not get refunds. I turned the phone face down, put on my coat, and walked to the shelter market where I had promised to help stock last-minute donations, carrying the box of art kits I had repurchased the week before with a steadiness that felt both petty and pure, and for 2 hours I taped tags and arranged small treasures on crowded tables while a line of tired parents smiled in that strained way that is still undeniably joy. And not a single one of them called me a loser when I handed them glitter glue and a puzzle with a missing corner. When I got home after dusk, the snow had finally started, slow dignified flakes that seemed determined to fall whether anyone approved or not, and waiting on my voicemail was the sound I had both anticipated and dreaded: Ethan's voice without the stage lights on. His words a low rush that mixed embarrassment with pleading as he said he had been suspended pending a review because the company had questions about personal expenses disguised as client dinners, and the stability letter that no longer existed, that Rachel's supplier had terminated the account, that daycare had placed the twins on a wait list after the new year, and that he would do whatever I wanted if I would unsend the document to the family and call his boss to vouch that he was a good man under stress. I sat at the table with the envelope still resting where I had laid it weeks ago, felt the tug of every old habit rescue, rationalize, repair, and recognized how intoxicating it is to become necessary again, how easy it would be to turn this moment into proof of my virtue, and I understood that forgiveness and enabling wear the same coat if you squint in December light. So I did the only thing that felt like an honest compromise between punishment and mercy. I opened a fresh email addressed to Marla with a short addendum clarifying that my rescission did not speak to Ethan's character or competence, only to financial responsibility, and I copied Ethan so he could see I had not knifed his whole life, just the part he had built on my back. Then I booked a single month of groceries for the twins at the corner market under a store credit with a note to the manager that only their mother could spend it and only on essentials, and I pressed purchase with a steadiness that felt like choosing to be an adult rather than a judge. Christmas Day itself I spent alone by design, with buttered toast, a long walk along the river where the geese honked like traffic cops, and an old movie I'd loved as a teenager because it taught me that sometimes the heroine is not a woman who wins the argument. She is the woman who leaves the room. The family thread sputtered into uneasy silence after a few final jabs, and no one called, perhaps because the evidence had made explanation a smaller sport than they liked. Late that night, as the credits rolled and the radiator sighed like a tired choir, my phone buzzed one last time with a message that contained neither apology nor accusation, but a photograph of the twins asleep under a threadbare blanket, cheeks pinked by heat, a stuffed bear between them like a diplomatic envoy, and the caption read, "They're okay tonight," which was not a capitulation and not a victory either, just a fact set gently on the table between our lives. I powered the phone down, washed the mug, and stood at the window while the snow thickened and erased the lines between parked cars and sidewalks and lawns, and I wondered, not for the first time, whether I had told the truth for the right reasons or merely because it allowed me to stop carrying the wrong ones. Whether justice delivered without grace is just a tidy form of cruelty, and whether the difference even matters when the house finally holds under its own beams. In the dark glass my reflection looked older and also lighter, and I heard myself promise that if there was another Christmas like this I would choose the same calm blade and the same measured cut, then immediately question the comfort of that certainty. Because endings we write ourselves always feel correct until someone asks where the missing piece went, and because somewhere in a suspended office a file bears my name beside the word rescinded while 2 blocks away, a small store account waits under Rachel's number, and in that uneasy balance hangs a truth I am not quite brave enough to name.